I have the pleasure of talking to Philip Chudy. Is that how to pronounce it? Philip Chudy, right? It's Chudy.
Hoodie, yes.
Hoodie. Ah, of course. Hoodie. And that's the Eastern European origins of hoodie. That's Tell me more about your this journey you've been on to exhibit your father's work.
Yeah, actually, it started quite a long time ago. I don't know really how it happened. My sister was alive at the time. She was looking after the collection. She was amenable to the idea of showing the work since she'd lived with it all these years, and we just thought that we would offer it to the gallery, National Gallery, for an exhibition. But then pandemic happened, and so that knocked a couple of years off the project. And so it
Let's go backwards first of all. Who is David Chudy?
So, well, he's my dad, but he's a guy who I'm beginning to discover him because he died when I was 13. So he died, I think it was 50 or 51 years old. Um, and he was somebody rather who I thought I knew. But basically, he was a guy. So I lived in a family with big contradiction. My mother told everything about her life and childhood, and he was a guy, and all of his brothers, who told nothing. We didn't know how big the family was. We didn't know where they came from. We did. It was simply they walked out. I mean, they came from Poland. In fact, we didn't even know exactly. Part of his life was spent in Danzig, which was not really part of Poland. It was a free port, and so we had no real uh, idea about anything. And he died when I was a teenager and not really interested in hanging out with dad. So I thought that I knew him, and then my mother existed for a long time. And you get this feeling with all the sculpture around you and paintings that there are no more questions to ask. So, I mean, the same thing happened really to do with, we're going to get onto it, sculpture of your ancestor, um, which, I grew up with this
Yes.
and never questioned, I knew who it was, but why it was done and so on was a point. So, yeah, David was a guy who now I'm learning, had a couple of, he was the youngest in a family, had a couple of older brothers. Nobody was interested in art at all in this family. In fact, I did now discover my grandmother was illiterate, um, and that a couple of the brothers went to Palestine, and life was too tough for them. So they decided to, somehow they went back and they got visas for South Africa. So there were three brothers um, uh, who basically left Poland. They were the older ones.
And these are the years. This is
No, this
1939.
was before that. So I think these older brothers must have left in 1937 or so. I mean, I'm gathering there are a couple of letters that I found, and I get the impression of a discussion, a superficial discussion with one of my father's favorite brother who, I mean, all the family died in the Holocaust, so um, don't know much about them. Don't really. I mean, there are a few photos. We're not sure who's who. But in these letters, it sounded as if, well, it was taken for granted that everybody's ambition was to go away. It's probably similar to Zimbabwe now with the diaspora, sort of dream of getting a job somewhere else with good money. Um, so these people were taking it automatically that if they had an opportunity to go elsewhere, they might. But yeah, so they,
So you're talking about a family of Polish Jews in the second just before the Second World War, who are basically, it's not just really opportunity. They're looking to save their lives. They're looking for a place to
I think
survive.
probably not quite that much, but it began to be that the closer it got. So I think these couple of older brothers went. I don't. By 1937 or so, I don't really know whether there was a threat the Germans were going to invade Poland, but there was definitely stuff written in some of these letters where people were talking about. They somehow or other had a sense of what was coming. But the older brothers left with a degree of comfort and ended up in South Africa. My father, somehow or other, must have, from a few photos, it was 1935, he was in London with his brothers, who I think were getting visas. The next I know was that 1938, nearly 1939, he ends up somehow in South Africa, unable to get a visa. Northern Rhodesia, I think, had more open quotas. I've no idea how it was that he went up there, but he, um, as my mother writes, he stayed 2 weeks with his untrained plumber, and my father um, learned plumbing, went to Northern Rhodesia, and got this job plumbing an entire mine township. Um, he worked for Wilbur Smith's dad. Yeah, anyway, he went up there, he worked on the mines, and somehow or other, there's this guy my mother describes who was keen on painting. There was nobody up there, and who really was that interested in art. But he got a job in the mines so that he could go underground and try and paint pictures of people working underground. And he started painting pictures, which is strange because, I thought that later in life when I knew him, he was a guy who didn't really, was very quite private. He was socially friendly, but he didn't show his work to people. He uh, I don't know, he seemed to be completely relaxed about it. But I never thought of him as somebody rather who had any ambitions in the art world. And now, recently, I've discovered all these photos where there's the young guy in his 20s, posing like for selfies. Look at me next to my latest painting. Look at me painting this. So I think he started. I mean, there was no audience to play to, but I think he was playing to a fantasy audience. He was trying to be a young show-off. Yeah. So, so 1947, he married my mother Ellen, and they went on a. Initially, it was meant to be a trip to Cape Town. They decided they may as well get married and make it into a honeymoon. And they passed through southern Rhodesia, and somehow they decided, let's move there. And they got a visa eventually. It was, you remember, northern Rhodesia and southern Rhodesia were separate countries. But at that point, they got a permit to move to Salisbury, and they stayed in army barracks in Cranbourne, um, kind of refugee kind of dwelling. And somehow or other, pretty quickly, he started making business and painting and offering art classes and yeah, that's what I'm beginning to discover.
Interesting. And so now, flash forward, this now 2024, you finally come to the end of that sort of unraveling of that story in a way of things that you never knew because he died when you were 13. So there were so many questions I'm sure you had answered by putting together this exhibit, in collaboration with the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. How's that journey been for you?
Well, it's been very interesting. It's hard in a way because it largely was happening or accelerated because of the passing of my sister, which meant that I used to think that this house was there forever and the art was contained and safe, and suddenly it was, you need to do something about it, and so the invitation for the exhibition was open for these couple of years, and now it was really a question of okay, um, the stuff needs to be moved and take your opportunity. And it seemed as if we, basically just got back onto the same track that we'd been on before. And the big thing that I discovered, the idea of, you know, the National Gallery really is part of it was started by Frank McEwen. I mean, there were all kinds of arguments about whether um, uh, his approach was a kind of colonial approach, but nonetheless, it was for fostering uh, local art. And this is a big mission for the current gallery. And it's in some ways it's interesting because it has really nothing to do with what David was doing. On the other hand, there seems to be quite a big interest. I mean, there's a big hunger for influences from earlier artists. And also, there's one thing that I've noticed, not just in terms of Zimbabwean artists, who many people are doing abstract work, but I've noticed in many artists all over Africa, there's there's still an interest in doing portraits, for example, and doing things which are sort of the traditional painting, copying reality, celebrating reality, as opposed to something totally abstract and totally conceptual. And I think this is probably quite a part of an interest in David's work, because basically almost everything he did were portraits of people who even if he did an abstract painting, he sat with somebody in front of him. Um, he produced the work. I mean, the one or two incongruous pictures where he's painting, he has a model sitting there, and his painting doesn't look anything like the model, but it's his inspiration. So, but yeah, I think that there's probably an appeal for some of uh, that
Yeah, the
stuff.
nostalgia of the way art used to be done, where it was very based on encounters, really, because I mean, just thinking about his encounter with my grandfather, King Mwanawina III of Barotseland. Tell us a bit about that story. I mean, because he wasn't just a painter, he was also a scientist. He was also kind of an explorer in terms of just a traveler, if you'd say. Tell us about that
Yeah.
story of how he met
Well, I
Mwanawina.
don't really know the details of the story. We just find this material. So basically, the run up to this was when he died. Um, there were a large number of sculptures which were, when you make something out of clay, you basically make a plaster model of it, because the clay will dry and crack up and it won't last. So you make a plaster cast of the thing, and then you proceed to, if you're lucky, you make it in bronze. And he did lost wax casting. He's probably the first person in southern Africa. I'm not entirely sure. They're the Benin bronzes in West Africa. So lost wax process was done through history, but in terms of modernity, he was the first guy, and with a guy who worked with him to do his own bronze casting in Zimbabwe. So basically, there's this period before which they did bronze casting themselves, and I can't tell. I think that somebody must have commissioned the bust of Lewanika. Well, all I knew was I was 13, 14 years old. My mother said, "Do you want some pocket money? There are all these molds which we can't enjoy. They're just ugly things piled up in a storehouse. Would you like to cast them as positive plaster molds?" And I did that. So we ended up with, some of the things are in bronze, but many of them are in plaster. And this was one of them. So I worked with it. It's quite a complicated process. I see it now. It's not just pouring some plaster into a mold. You have to do
Mhm.
reinforcing. I must have spent quite a lot of time touching it and with all of them. Um, anyway, so there's this bust that we have, and we knew who it was. And when we grew up, me and my sister knew the name. Nobody ever asked why was it done, who was it done for. Then, when I started trying to put this book together, I decided to try and figure out where is it. So I went on the internet, I thought somewhere there's something of this. Then I found a movie, an 8 millimeter movie, which showed there are quite a few movies which were taken in the Congo and Northern Rhodesia and East Africa, but it showed a village. It showed dancing. And the actual movie didn't show anything about Lewanika himself, but it showed this. But just towards the end, there's this little banner across the street. Oh, I call it, anyway, it says King Lewanika. And the end of the movie, the roll, shows a picture from a private aeroplane you can see by the wing flying over the Zambezi. And then the tail end of it shows Nyanga. So trying to piece things together, trying to be Sherlock Holmes, you
So was that 1960? What year
well,
was
I
that?
don't know. I originally thought he and my mother spent 9 years in northern Rhodesia. If he did a picture of Lewanika, it must have been when he was there. But it doesn't figure because the style of the sculpture is the style he did later. He wasn't doing bronze casting or even thinking about it. So, things were not done that way. And then this movie showed, at the end of it, it showed Nyanga. And as far as I can see from the records, this had to be after they moved to southern Rhodesia. And then I'm thinking, well, it must be a commission because, much as he did paintings and sculptures of people that he knew, maybe they were well known, but he wasn't the kind of a guy who would get on a private plane. And I think I checked out that the flight would have been 500 miles or so, fly up to somewhere where there are no major airports, to make a sculpture which, what do? I mean, you make it out of clay. Can you dump it into the aeroplane out of clay? It will get damaged. Maybe you have to stay there a while and make a cast of it. Then you fly back. Um, and if somebody was commissioned you, I mean, you would think, oh, there's a bronze cast, which in those days, if I'm guessing right, um, well, the other thing to guess is he was knighted. Do you remember what year that was? But that was,
Yes, that was like 1960.
yeah, so it's logical to think somebody commissioned David to do the thing around the time of the knighthood. But I think 1960, I'm not even sure if David was doing his own bronze casting. I don't know. I really don't know. But so since then, we discovered for the movie. Then we discovered there's a whole lot of photos which are in the book, which show the trip to
Yes, he was knighted in
59.
1959.
Okay. Can you remind me of the name of the town where was it the winter residences or the
Leah Louis.
so yeah, so there are the pictures from there. Then now I've just recently discovered some color pictures, some Kodachromes taken at that time, which matched the movie, and there were black and white ones. And there are pictures of the king standing next to his bust, um, and
Right.
family people.
But the thing is, in our family tradition, we have a tradition of kings and queens sitting for their portraits. We have like busts of one of our kings from the 1840s that's in the British Museum, and all sorts of things like that. So I definitely think he commissioned the portraits himself. I think Liwanika was part of that process.
That makes quite a lot of sense, but really the thing was that what happens to it? The plaster, the clay model is fragile. The plaster cast is not really that much use. You can make a positive, as I did, but ultimately you need to cast it in bronze or something solid. And this process would have had was not done except perhaps sending it off to Britain or Italy or somewhere like that at that time. And then it's the thing should have
Right.
ended up some. This would be heavy if this was in bronze. This I mean I carried some of these sculptures. This thing would, even though it's the whole point about the lost wax processing is that you have a hollow sculpture,
Right.
but even so,
Interior.
it's still going to be 60, 70 pounds or so for a thing that size.
Well. Yes. Well, hopefully in my lifetime we'll get it done. I'll
Yeah,
get
and
one done. Get a
also
proper
find
bronze.
if any copy was ever
Yeah,
made, find where the other one is sitting. But yeah,
exactly. But so just give us an overview of what's the exhibit going to have? It's going to have clearly some of these busts in terms of these
sculptures, I mean, just counts, yeah.
the cast. Yeah, you're going to have you're going to have the cast. You're going to have 16 millimeter film.
Well, this depends. So what I'm proposing is so. Well, just to back up for a second, just when I came back last time, I suddenly found a pile of negatives of the kind of photos that I'd never seen in my life from my father, which were mostly Northern Rhodesia from 1938. A few of them are Southern Rhodesia at the end, and they're all done in black and white. And nothing much was done with them. And they are portraits, and as a photographer myself, I was
Hmm.
impressed because these are unlike his later work. These were done with a background. I mean, you'd call them environmental portraits. And not just close
Hmm.
up to somebody's face, but basically where they live or what the environment is like. And uh, so these were all in terrible condition, but I sweated like mad in order to scan them all and try and repair them. So this is a very new thing. These things didn't exist before. So I think those pictures, the movie, it's all a possibility that I want to provide that they could run on TV sets, ATV or multiple TV sets in the
Right,
gallery.
installations. Yeah, in installations. That sounds amazing. Well, Philip, I think I don't really want us to talk anymore because I don't want to spoil it for the audience. But I think we've given them so much information because his pieces are they're sort of textual in the sense that the textuality is not just three dimensional. You know, it's paint on canvas. It's also, of course, sculpture. It's also documenting that period of time in the story of the Rhodesias and Barotseland in the middle, because remember Zambia didn't exist at the time, and Barotseland was a protectorate in the middle of all of this as well. So that's part of that story. But I think that's what fascinates me about your father's art is it is a slice of the outside world inside Africa at the same time. You know, he was an outsider insider kind of thingy. You know, and I
Mhm.
think that what he brings to the story of Southern Africa during that period of time, during the federations, during the federation of trying to amalgamate those territories that were illegal at the time. It's just fascinating to me just to see how the social history is wrapped up in the story of your dad and your family, moving out of Eastern Europe and moving into Southern Africa. So I think there's a lot of, yeah, this the textuality, as well as the other thing I was going to say is that there's also a reconstruction that you're doing, a reconstructing of your family history through these pieces of art, and each one of them tells a story. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the curator and you sort of unfold that story and tell this other narrative that is, Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I just want to say also that, I look at this story and I think there was a guy, he must have been in it, he was, I think, 22 or so when he came to Africa. Uh, Basically, it wasn't like some, I mean, clearly he brought a fair amount of stuff from Europe with him, but quite a lot of what he did was built up there based on local conditions. So in
Mm,
a sense, I get a feeling that it was him discovering a new thing. There were the local people, they were colonized and so on, but introduced to technology in the future. And it's not like he was so much transplanted. I think he went to Europe, and the idea of becoming a European artist, and I get the feeling he went back to Africa and said, "No, this is where I am. I'm part of this voyage of discovery with everybody there." And looking at these photos, the amount of kind of empathy between him and, I mean, white and black people in all those photos seem to be confident. This doesn't look like your servile situation back in the day when everybody thought, oh, you must be bowing to the great white master. It doesn't seem like that at all. So I think that this is really part of a discovery, a mutual discovery, basically at that
Yes,
time moving forward. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Thank
Wow.
you.
Thank you. Thank you as well.
This is great.